Hi everyone, how's it going? And welcome to the Changing Body Composition lecture. So for this, I think a lot of people are generally quite interested in the topic, and obviously, um, statistically speaking, many people are looking to change their body composition at some point in time in their lives, if not currently. So, again, I feel this will be a lecture of great interest to many people. There's two main ways, again, that we've discussed so far, or two main components as far as our total body mass that we typically discuss about. One is our fat-free mass, and then our fat mass. So, to speak briefly and initially to increasing our fat-free mass, in particular our skeletal muscle, one of the best ways to do that is through hypertrophy or strength training to increase some of our muscle mass. We'll speak to how that might influence, say, our resting metabolic rate, etc., and our body composition as far as percentage a bit later on. But I just wanted to speak to that first because the majority of the conversation is towards body fat percentage or body fat mass. So we look at our mean percent of fat. Typically, it's lower than our normal healthy individual or in the general population for athletes. And when we look at the difference between men and women, as discussed previously, men will have a lower limit, an absolute lower limit of about 5%, and for women about 12 to 14%. And that's for a number of different reasons. Speaking directly to tissues themselves, for women, for example, there's breast tissues, which will increase the amount of fat mass. But in addition to that, also based off of hormones and generally body types for women, usually having more stored energy, in particular for preparation for child rearing or motherhood or parenthood. There's different techniques that we use to measure this, as we discussed in a prior lecture in our lab. And so some of these differences that we'll see in fat percentages, in particular when we talk about different sports, might come from some of the differences in the measuring techniques, but generally you can take some averages and get a pretty good idea of what is ideal. And yes, we'll speak to again this starting of the topic. Primarily with athletes. So body composition can vary greatly among athletes in different positions of the same sport too. This all speaks to the specialization of each position or each sport if you're comparing intersport. So even though women have a higher total body fat percent relative to men, this is true even in the case of comparable health and fitness metrics. And we have to have a certain amount of body fat to have physiological functioning. Our brains in and of themselves are primarily fat-based, let alone subcutaneous fat for energy. And low body fat, generally we tend to think of that as helping improve our health, and that's true, but to a point, extreme low body fat percentage can increase your health risks because you start losing functioning that we need from stored adipose tissue or stored fats. And this is true even in a sports context. So one example is a fairly well-known high-level long-distance triathlete from Canada a few years ago had become so hyper-focused. He admitted to this after a certain race where he didn't perform very well. And he essentially had been so hyper-focused on getting lean, so in other words, losing fat mass, to be able to try to maximize his efficiency, and it essentially got to the point where it was so low that his performance suffered. Essentially, he got to this long time endurance event, Ironman distance event, and ended up, performance suffered and had to withdraw. So, yeah, and so again, there's always to a point with these things, but having that in mind, performance typically for certain sports will improve with a certain range of body fat percentage. Now, the mean percent of body fat for athletes, I think this is interesting to look comparatively between sports. You'll see, on the lower end, you tend to have sports where it's either aesthetic in nature, like gymnastics, or endurance based, where you have to carry a lot of your own body weight around with you, and therefore it's more efficient or better to have less. So cycling being an example of that, and if we look at distance running as well. Sprinting, a bit of an anomaly where again, lower body fat percentage is good. But we can also look at sports like shot put, where mass can sometimes help, even if it is body fat percentage. Volleyball, football, again, because they're averages and because, different positions, with football, we'll have a different fat percentage for the different positions. But even now you look at linebackers, and even though they're very large individuals who carry a lot of muscle mass on them, they'll tend to have very little fat mass on them as well nowadays, primarily because velocity along with mass helps them play their position better. Whereas traditionally, I think it was considered just any mass was good mass. So you'd see very different body compositions then, primarily more fat mass versus or higher fat mass percentages then. Yeah, okay. So maybe you've seen a sport that you play, and and I apologize, I was just looking at the men's category there. If you look in the women's category as well, by relation to, you'll see those same trends where gymnastics, for example, where's our running at? Yeah, distance running, distance sprinting, and bodybuilding's kind of its own unique thing, but those will be the tendencies to have lower fat mass percentages, whereas things like shot put, volleyball, what was the other one we were looking at? Football, there's no football, but let's say judo, for example, a little bit higher. Okay, so whether we are part of a sport and an athlete, or whether we shift or look at our focus with the general population, again, typically a lot of people look to lose or keep fat mass off. And part of this, of course, is socio-cultural and a media based thing, but also a performance thing if we're thinking about athletics, and a health thing if we're considering maybe a farther end of the spectrum for those individuals who might be obese or overweight. The goal is to decrease fat mass. And I think a lot of us have the same goal or desire, because our bodies do typically have this tendency, or this drive, this biological drive, to try to keep fat on and energy stores present. So again, if we're looking at our nutrition, and I dislike the word diet, I understand technically it is correct, but diet and dieting has become such this rather problematic thing. So modifying nutrition, or having good nutrition, is in my opinion a better way to phrase what the desired goal is there. And yeah, so when we're considering that in regards to our body composition, we can see we need to consider our macro and micronutrients. So our macronutrients, if you think back to our metabolism, is our carbohydrates, our fats, and proteins. And our micronutrients are any vitamins and minerals that we also need to supplementary have. And so whenever we're thinking about reducing let's say, what we're taking in as far as nutrition and calories. Really, really important to ensure these other components are there. They're absolutely necessary to maintain health and well-being. In particular, if we're also exercising, depending on our training volumes and intensities, we absolutely positively need to ensure that we have proper nutrients in our body. And again, that really, that might become an issue before you start, say, trying to use this energy balance, or in other words, trying to cut calories in order to put this ratio of the amount of calories expended being more than what you're taking in, again, with the goal being for losing body mass. Okay. Now, ultimately, and we spoke about this prior in lab, where our total daily energy expenditure, or TDEE, is our basal metabolic rate, our caloric expenditure for physical activity. So that includes non-exercise based stuff, as well as exercise, and our food metabolic activity that's required for us to process food. So all of that together is our total daily energy expenditure. But again, the primary driver on a lot of that is our basal metabolic rate, being the largest percent. And any changes to that will change the amount of fat mass loss that we are hoping for. So how do we go about this? Well, we want to do so wisely. Of course, we ideally will not be engaging in any like quote unquote crash diets or short-term dieting. And the reason for that is the long-term benefit. You actually get a bit of a recoil where your body will tend to want to keep more calories on this. It's not sustainable, and again, a lot of the time, if we're talking about fat mass and trying to keep a healthy, sustainable body total body mass for the duration of our lives, we'll want to ensure that our nutrition and our physical activity balance is something that we can maintain. So I digress. So with our goals to lose fat mass, we don't want to lose free fat mass, because the idea is we want to keep, say, for example, lean tissue on, because that will keep our resting metabolic rate up, okay? And once we maintain that loss, we want to keep it once it's gone, right? So one of the ways we can do this is we want to ensure that we're losing any weight slowly. Now, generally, you'll see terms out there from anywhere from 1 to 2 pounds per week. But from my clinical experience and watching people try to go through this process, a lot of the time that's quite a lot. So if you start at about half a pound a week and think more like 1 to 2 pounds per week, that's really what we're looking for. So when ultimately people are hoping to lose 10 pounds, you'll see advertisements for 4 or 6 weeks, this sort of thing. And sure enough, that might be true. You might be able to do that in a short amount of time. But again, ultimately, it's not sustainable. And in the long run, you actually have that a little bit of a recoil where biologically your body's really trying to get back the caloric deficit that you had created. So you want to be kind of sneaky about this. You want to ensure that your body almost doesn't realize, to use non-scientific terms, that this change is happening, right? And so ultimately the best way to go about this is a combination of diet and exercise, or nutritional intake and exercise. And there's a few different ways that you can do this. So when you're trying a new nutritional avenue, research generally suggests a couple of main ways to go. And again, everyone's bodies will respond slightly differently. And I feel this is some of where the frustration comes from when people try to lose fat or go through some sort of weight management program, is they feel like because they try one certain nutritional avenue and it doesn't work for them, they get frustrated and maybe a bit deterred from continuing on. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's just about a matter of finding something that works well for them. And so one of the things that people often ask is like, well, what is the best nutritional approach to take, or is there a specific diet I should be following? And ultimately the answer is no. Ultimately the simplest and most straightforward one that we've generally come to know through common knowledge is more vegetables, a variety of nutrients. Again, this is barring any specific maybe allergies that you have, is ultimately the best. There's a few different methods that can help people when they're trying to look at, say, like a caloric energy balance, or and trying to manage that. And one approach is managing portions and trying to figure that out. So there's a bit of a hand size guide method. So you can use your thumb, you use the palm of your hand. And that's one method that's essentially a tool for people to be able to understand nutrition and portion sizing a lot better. You can try going down the route of biofeedback, so getting people to become more in tune with their body senses and cues to again understand more internally what's driving them to eat, and that usually helps as well. Sometimes a points-based dieting or nutritional intake method has been shown to be beneficial and helpful for some. And ultimately what it is it just assigns certain points to certain foods, and therefore allows people to get away from trying to handle maybe calculating complicated calories and nutrients and intake, and essentially have a simpler points-based score that maybe they just add up to 20 in a day rather than trying to manage 2,000 calories. And so part of that is your textbook will say that you need a specific or a range of, say, kilocalories expended through exercise each day, or, as we'll see on the next slide, that a certain amount of calories that you should intake in a day. And these are very rough approximations. I really, really, really want to, it's right here. Really want to emphasize that these are just general guidelines and are absolutely by no means a steadfast for every single individual. Depends who you are, where your starting mass is at, and from there, again, having a very, very small decrease or change day to day. So for example, I would generally say, you want to look for a deficit of maybe 200 kcals a day, okay? And that, again, depends on who you are and what your starting mass is. Because if you look at 200 kcals as a deficit each day, and your starting daily caloric intake, just based off of your basal metabolic rate, is around 1,200. Well, now there's a very large percentage of your body weight, right? That you're already cutting out. Whereas if you have a mass that's quite significantly more, your daily caloric intake could be maybe close to 3,000. So cutting out 200 calories a day is not going to be too significant, but it'll be enough, right? So hopefully that made sense. Again, it's very individualized, even though your text will give you ranges, or you might see numbers thrown around. I know the 1,200 kcal a day diet is supposed to be out there and work, but again, that works best for people that just naturally, or based off of their lifestyle, their physical activity, and their basal metabolic rate, are probably only at maybe 1,400 kcals a day to start with. And so the small deficit that's created is manageable and is able to be maintained, and can help slowly, again, about a half pound to a pound, maybe a week, decrease in their weight. Just to tie in that one last talk, if you're talking about trying to lose 2 pounds per week, it's really, really challenging. unless, let's say, you're have quite a bit of mass on you already. Well, then that percentage of what 2 pounds per week is, or the percentage of deficit of calories per day, is a lot less. And and so you have a higher opportunity of being successful with that. Okay. If you undergo a nutrition modification, or trying to manage your weight through modifying what you're taking in, primarily through managing how many calories you take in versus how many calories you expend through physical activity and your basal metabolic rate, some things to consider is drinking enough water. So one of the reasons this comes to be is, again, if you're cutting the amount of food you're actually taking in that has water with it, that's important to replenish. But also we lose some water through glycogen loss as well when we're running a deficit for energy. The next point is to make some sensible fat choices. So these are tips, by the way, too, just as you're going through weight loss, and they're pretty well supported. Making sensible fat choices. Just to speak to that for a moment, if you take a look at fats versus proteins, and I got one more slide here for fats versus starches, but when you're considering exactly how small of an amount of fats you consume in order to have 100 calories intake, relative to the other types of food where you have quite a large amount of foods, again, looking at starches, quite a larger volume of food for 100 calories relative to fats. So making smart fat choices means, you can have foods that are high in fat, but you also want them to be high in nutrients, and you don't want to overconsume those too much, because again, the calories can add up rather quickly. The other thing is minimizing empty calories. So these are very like sugary pop drinks, or typically a lot of foods that are just based around flavor, such as fat and or sugar or salt, versus actually having a lot of nutrients in them. And I do like to tie these 2 points in actually with the next one, and we'll talk to that in a moment. But again, you want to make sensible choices. You want to minimize how many empty calories you're taking in. So you want lots of foods that are nutrient dense or have a lot of micro nutrients in. So as we spoke about before, vitamins and minerals, right? And part of that approach that I mentioned before is you want to reduce your caloric intake, not by a lot and not drastically. Okay, you kind of want to slowly increase the amount of calories that you're reducing over a long period of time. So for example, if you the text gives a specific example of kcals per day. So for myself, this would be too low based off of my basal metabolic rate and the amount of activities I do day to day. So again, this is very, very individualized. These are maybe if you're someone that would take in 2,000 calories a day or less, as it was, based off of your basal metabolic rate and physical activity. So that's probably very few. I would suggest probably a small number of individuals in the population, but I digress. So if you're looking for about 100 to 200 kcal deficit each day to start with, and then changing like month to month or so, this approach would be good. And so just to give you an idea of again, portion sizing and types of foods that comprise 200 calories, I do this with a lot of my clients. I think it's just a good aha moment for many people. But if you're trying to stick to a 1,200 calorie a day caloric intake, you get to pick 6 of these plates. And again, maybe for some of us that's sufficient, but as I said, for myself, that would drive me into a very low caloric deficit, or a high caloric deficit and a very low energy day very quickly. So again, great if you look at vegetables. Again, vegetables are such a great thing. Very nutrient dense, and very low caloric per volume. So when we're trying to think again of our stomachs giving us feedback for how full we are, having some high volume foods, low calorie is amazing for that. You can see a whole pile of carrots, etc. But if we look at things like Hershey Kisses, it's sugar and fat. It's a very, very small portion. Cheese, has good nutrients in it, high in fat, so we can only have a small amount of that. 3 eggs, again, fats and proteins, not very many carbs. And so, yeah, hopefully that just gives you a bit of idea. Our big volume ticket items, again, sure enough, fruits and vegetables, filling up our plates excellently. Things that are less so, candies, Hershey and chocolates, again, those are going to be our empty calories. Okay. Yeah, and again, the idea behind keeping portions somewhat small is we essentially allow our brains and our stomachs to stay in time with one another. If we eat too much too quick, we tend to overconsume calories. And what will happen, essentially our brain, it takes about 20 minutes for our stomach signal to get to our brains. So if we eat smaller portions, we can wait 20 minutes. If we're still quite hungry, we can eat some more, and we know we won't be overeating. Yeah, so again, start slow and low, slowly continue to eat until you're full. Okay. Performing physical activity to aid in this caloric expenditure and minimize free fat mass loss is important, right? So we want to tip that scale between how much we expend versus how much we take in. We can do that from both sides. Plus, when we exercise, we know we help build muscle, right? And again, that will ensure that our basal metabolic rate stays up and doesn't drop down too low while we're trying to reduce calories, in which case our body has that conservation approach and wants to hold on to calories longer. Okay. And so with all of this, whenever undergoing any sort of weight management programming or endeavor, I think the number one thing, and it's unfortunate that your text actually doesn't include this, is ultimately a lot of nutrition modification and even exercise programming for many people ultimately comes down to behavior modification. So how can we modify or understand our behavior, our emotions, our environmental cues to be able to modify and change that? So again, a lot of people will not necessarily understand what cues truly are hunger in them, and have certain feelings or beliefs that certain cues mean they're hungry or they're in a starving state and will tend to eat more frequently or often or more than they actually need to. And so things that can help with this is CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy, and or habit building. Both of these will help people modify their behaviors in during their journey or understanding of how to modify weight. Great. Okay, so when we exercise, a number of things happen. And again, this is beneficial. So we kind of spoke about nutrition, now we're on to exercise. So it can decrease fat mass, which we know because caloric expenditure, if it's larger than our what we take in, we can see that effect. I think the important thing to note there is the saying is true as much as it is cliche. You can't outrun a bad nutrition, right? So if you're doing tons and tons of exercise, but you're still taking in a lot of calories, that ratio of expenditure to intake isn't going to be skewed in the direction you want, and you won't see fat mass loss if that's your goal. You can, again, increase lean muscle, as we were speaking about, as far as continuing exercise. And I just wanted to note, one of the important things about that is ensuring that you're still getting the required nutrients that you need. One, to ensure that your exercise is actually at an adequate and sustainable level to get this higher energy expenditure completed. But also, for example, when you want to restore your muscles and have them be repaired, and to keep your lean muscle mass, you need to make sure that that side of the equation is present as well. And so by changing either one of these, you're going to change the body fat percentage. And that's the one thing people forget about body fat percent. So even though your weight maybe goes up, the body fat percentage can still be going down, right? And ultimately, if people are looking for more of just an aesthetic and or performance based change in their body composition, weight has less to do about it than body fat percentage and body composition, right? So just to say that one more time, if I was to say my whole body weight or mass goes up, it could be because my free fat mass or my lean muscle is going up and my fat mass might be coming down, but together kind of, proportionately, I'm still have an increase in weight. Okay, I tried saying that a couple of different times. Hopefully one of them worked for you. And so one of the tricks ultimately, because we have and can measure really well how much food and calories we're taking in, it takes a lot of time, energy, and effort to do so meticulously, but we can have a decent idea. Estimating how much we expend is a little bit trickier because it depends on a lot of different factors. Body mass that we have when we start, our training intensity. Not only that, but with the intensity, if we're to think about sets and repetitions or lengths or rest periods, if we're doing interval training, the intensity changes over the duration of an activity quite a lot. Moment to moment, we're working at different energy expending intensities, right? So that's really a challenge to consider. Which muscles are engaged? When we're using, say, larger muscle groups, we're going to be expending more energy versus smaller. So if we perform a certain full body exercise, let's say swimming, and we kick a lot more than we pull with our upper body, that will change how much actual energy expenditure we have. If we're talking about strength training, the number of sets and repetitions or the length of our rest periods become very significant. Because less rest will mean a higher heart rate and output. But then also if we're working larger muscle groups, that's going to take longer to repair. So our post-exercise caloric expenditure is going to be higher. So I digress. So when we're talking about strength training, relative to, say, steady state endurance or aerobic activity is much more challenging to try to accurately measure and calculate the energy expenditure of strength training versus aerobic training. Okay, so continuing on with the conversation about exercise and the different things that can happen while we're exercising as far as our body composition. One of the challenges with taking our nutrition and exercise into consideration is what happens with our appetite. So as we exercise, we tend to, while we're exercising, have a decrease in appetite. And so that happens for a few reasons. One, we have more catecholamines. So if you remember the fight or flight versus rest and digest, we get our fight or flight hormones and catecholamines, stimulants essentially in our body flying around. We have elevated body temperature. So because of that extra heat, it makes us not particularly hungry. And another is hormonal changes. So I wanted to pause here for a second and speak about ghrelin, leptin, and insulin. So we get this kind of short and long-term feedback through our bodies. So one example, let's see if I can just pull up an image here. Okay, do we have all three here? No, sorry. I tried pulling up some images earlier for this particular part of the discussion. Okay. So if we take a look here, we can see that Leptin comes from our adipose tissue, ghrelin from our stomach, and if you recall, insulin comes from our pancreas. So what we have is some kind of feedback mechanisms built into our body that let us know we're hungry or that we're full. So ghrelin, for example, when our stomachs are empty and have been so for a while, we get a signal to our hypothalamus to cause us to become hungry. So then we want to eat. When we eat, we have a release of insulin as well as leptin. And what those two do is they cue up hunger. So now one of the interesting things that happens for individuals with high amounts of body fat or adipose tissue is they secrete increase or significant amounts of leptin. And with that leptin, what ends up happening is obese individuals essentially become resistant to leptin. So what that is a cue for fullness. So you can think if you don't ever really get a cue of satiation or fullness, that can be obviously a problem and a bit of a positive feedback mechanism as to why you want to eat or continue to eat or overeat, right? So that's definitely a challenge that individuals who are obese face for sure. And then the prolonged effect of exercise is, again, an overall increase in appetite. So again, this is something that new exercisers and dieters, if you will, tend to come across is even though they're exercising more, they tend to get this increased appetite and therefore continue to take in more calories than they're expending, and they find that as a challenge. Okay, so we'll speak briefly about the two differences between our caloric expenditure to resistance and aerobic training. Ultimately, at the end of the day, both are great and both are going to help expend calories, obviously at different rates based off of the intensities you're doing them at and how long you can do them for. But if you're trying to figure out like what is a best way to help manage weight, at the end of the day, you're ideally looking at both. So some sort of combination of aerobic and weight training. The weight training helps keep on free fat mass and increase your resting metabolic rate, whereas adding in the nutrition and behavior modification for nutrition is a really huge factor as well, right? So ultimately, again, both are great for helping manage weight and decrease fat mass. It's how you go about it and ensuring that the intake of calories doesn't expend that new expenditure, but that you have sufficient that you can maintain that for a long time, okay? And ultimately, when you're looking for that, the best way to go about it is depends how detailed you want to get, but again, start slow and low as far as how much you're taking out, as well as how much energy expenditure or physical activity you're increasing by, and ultimately you get to this point where you find a very manageable individualized point. You can obviously calculate these things as you've learned in your lab. And those are the main points for changing your body composition. So hopefully you took something out of that lecture. I know most people often do. And we will chat about what happens with severe weight loss on the next lecture. Okay, cheers.